Welcome to the debate. Our topic today is it's about the historical trajectory and cultural synthesis of these very centralized digital communities. We're specifically tracing their lineage right up to the formation of the federal Salubriety government, or, just Salubriety.
Right, and the source material gives us this really compelling historical analogy. It frames the birth of salubriety as something similar to the emergence of, and I'm quoting here, Visigothic successor states following the Roman imperial collapse. We're essentially talking about political entities, communities built around things like game modding or social networking that inherited the territories and the people of these fractured digital empires.
And that analogy, it really sets up our central question. Salubriety rose from the wreckage of these incredibly volatile spheres, Mead Hall, IMP, the Intermodding Project, and Panopticon. So the core question is, does Salubriety represent a truly stable, synthesized successor state that's actually broken that historical cycle of schism and collapse, or is its current consolidation just a temporary hub, an interregnum before it all inevitably fragments again?
I'm going to be arguing for the latter. While the state might look unified on the surface, I think Salubriety has inherited the deep genetic flaws of its volatile predecessors. A future collapse to me seems unavoidable, especially when you look at the history of the individuals it absorbed.
And I'll be taking the opposing view. I believe Salubrity's new governance structure and its cultural blend represent a decisive and lasting institutional break from that past volatility, showing an adaptive stability that its ancestors just completely lacked. I get why you have that sense of historical pessimism, I really do, but let me offer a different perspective on that structural shift. I think Salubriety is stable precisely because its new leadership core, we're talking Gar, A1, Tyrone, who founded that foundational HGS web server, and Chicken, they actively and decisively dealt with the fatal flaws that crippled the old empires.
Yeah. But what were those flaws? I mean, structurally speaking.
The instability that really defined the preceding Tyrone server era. It was rooted in what you could almost call anarchic moderation. Power was diffused, personalized conflicts regularly blew up into systemic breakdowns. We saw this cyclical, really immature behavior where high-influence members like Klansmen in Cyprus could just delete entire servers over incredibly petty disputes. The Jake Silent Hill incident, for instance, which led to the creation of the Mime House, that was just a public symptom of a much deeper immaturity.
It wasn't just immaturity, though. It was a complete lack of institutional trust that let individuals hold that kind of, destructive veto power.
Exactly. And the key is that the new leadership succeeded where the old failed. They initiated a definitive break by expelling those specific, drama-focused agitators, Klansmen and Cyprus. That action reflects a shift from that anarchic model to a centralized executive power, one that's capable of purging destabilizing elements. This is the evolutionary leap that was needed to stop the cycle of self-destruction. And beyond that, Salubriety actually succeeded in a true cultural synthesis. Unlike the monocultural hubs of the past, Mead Hall was almost exclusively about IRL and gaming ties. Impar was intensely focused on Hearts of Iron 4 modding. Salubriety unified populations from wildly different origins. You have Impar remnants, TFR Panopticon exiles, DC leftovers, Atlantriple-linked individuals. Its magnetic strength as the one singular home server, I think that proves its institutional longevity.
I guess I just come at it from a different angle. You talk about this decisive synthesis, but the data, to me, it suggests more of an illusion of consolidation. So while the server may be stable right now, the culture it absorbed is fundamentally volatile, and this unification, it only maximizes the potential points of failure by cramming all those volatile elements under one roof. The unification in July 2025 was, and the source material says this itself, the natural result of the other SVs dying. It wasn't some planned, successful merger of equal healthy states.
But isn't a successor state almost always built on the failure of what came before it?
It is. But look at the inventory of the people it absorbed. Salubriety became a haven for exiles. It took in figures like Nat Sundari, who was considered too volatile even for the old structures, right? He was banned from TFR, the Federation roleplay, and then exiled from Panopticon before he migrated. So you're aggregating individuals who are defined by their extreme instability. And worse, The internal structure is built on this inherited cultural tension that's just lying dormant. We saw this hierarchy in the preceding hub, in Panopticon, where the core IMPers were a tiny minority, maybe 10%, yet they held this outsized influence over the TFR new-gen majority. And that created a perception of a lower caste. That cultural incompatibility, which the source material suggests is still there in Salubriety, that's a ticking time bomb.
Okay, let's talk about that cultural time bomb then, and specifically how the leadership shift might have diffused it. I'd argue that the dominant influence of Tyrone's personal vibe, chiller and more laid back, which came from his HGSW-TF2 group and slack-jawed history, it fundamentally changed the cultural center of gravity. This moved the entire community away from that highly intense, conspiracy-driven, trolling-focused culture of core IMP under Cestino, who was known for this paranoia and madness that led to the old server collapsing.
That's a compelling argument for operational stability, I'll give you that. But have you considered that cultural traits are incredibly resilient? They survive long after the initial server is gone. You can't just claim a complete cultural overhaul when influential people from that intense IMP culture, like Baldwick, are still present and still exerting their weight. The source material specifically highlights Baldwick's history of dominating Panopticon voice chats with these long, often aggressive monologues. That deep-seated IMP minority influence, which stuck around in Panopticon because of their connections with Private Hazard, the founder, it doesn't just vanish because Tyrone set a chiller tone. The old guard still holds a disproportionate amount of conversational and cultural sway.
But that sway is now structurally counterbalanced. You have the mead hall diaspora, which brought a less aggressive, more IRL-focused conversational style. And then you have the DC Dojalore central lineages. They provide a necessary friction. The new state deliberately diluted the centralized power of those modding veterans.
But even if those tactical expulsions of clansmen in Cyprus were effective on an operational level, they didn't address the deeper cultural resistance to synthesis. And we see that manifested in the continued existence of Sork's server. Sork's server operates explicitly as a culturally stable satellite node. It's designed to preserve the pure IMP, Atlantropa, and DC lineages. This shows that these distinct pre-solubility identities are refusing to be fully incorporated. Doesn't that suggest solubility is functioning more like a temporary administrative capital, a point of convenience, rather than a truly unified cultural homeland that people feel loyalty to? I disagree with framing Seork's node as a competitor. I actually see it as an integrated and essential subsystem, one that's necessary for stability. Seork himself is a critical nexus. He's nearly omniscient across 5 major spheres: IMP, Atlantropa, TFR, Panopticon, and DC. His presence, and the presence of Ira, who link DC, TSB, and Atlantropa, these are crucial cross-sphere figures who stabilize the population. They provided the continuity with the mythic prehistory of Atlantropa and TSB, the sandbox, that allowed all these disparate groups to trust the new establishment. They are the political capital you need for synthesis. That trust came at a profound risk, though. And that brings us directly to the meaning of diaspora and this idea of migration contagion. The age of collapse, particularly around 2023, established these destructive patterns that Salubriety is now absorbing. After the complete collapse of Mead Hall, 2 core figures, Evan and James, they entered this wandering phase. The historical record states, pretty tragically, that James orbiting Evan resulted in them slowly killing every single server they visited, like Hazard Hotel, by introducing Evan's particularly aggressive nature and just fostering instability. You're highlighting the destructive nature, sure, but you're ignoring the strategic necessity of breaking that cycle.
But importing figures like that into a single unified hub, even peripherally, you risk importing the very mechanisms of collapse itself. This is the contagion effect that's inherent in decentralized digital governance. When your most unstable members are forced to migrate, they carry the seeds of schism with them to the next place. And the sheer volume of this volatile diaspora migrating to Salubriety because all the other servers died, it just ensures the foundation is riddled with latent fault lines.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning. The movement into Salubriety was driven by a calculated necessity, which successfully broke that wandering phase you're describing. The lax vetting that came after the necessary expulsion of Klansmen and Searpras, that was a strategic risk taken by Tyrone and A1, and that risk paid off. It succeeded in attracting those necessary cross-sphere figures, Ira and Sjurk, who brought their established networks and large populations, effectively ending the server hopping. This influx provided the continuity and the population mass needed to stabilize the whole political project. It attracted refugees who were explicitly tired of the constant instability caused by the Wanderers. The system adapted to survive, absorbing necessary components like those bridging the Atlantropa connection, while filtering out the known toxic ones like Forsyth, who had been successfully kicked out of Meat Hall long before its final collapse.
Okay, but your argument relies on the current leadership being perfect judges of character and cultural toxicity, and we have to consider the historical precedent of failed successor states. That's maybe the strongest indicator of Salubrity's ultimate fate. We have a clear and frankly tragic historical model that defines the IMP lineage. IMP to Gnarless Nation, to George Bush Nation, to Panopticon. 4 successive attempts at synthesis, and every single one ended in collapse.
And what was the recurring failure point in those 4 attempts?
The core issue every single time was a profound cultural disparity, a refusal to truly blend. Gnarlos failed because the original core IMP culture couldn't tolerate the more aggressive elements and the political chaos brought in by the Alt-Dogalore, or ADL influence. George Bush Nation was an attempt to consolidate that tension, and it also imploded. Panopticon failed because the TFR New Gens lacked the shared institutional history or loyalty of the IMP minority, which created that structural hierarchy we already discussed. Salubriety is just a larger, more complex version of the same, fundamentally flawed model. It's built on the physical ruins of the defunct DC, Meat Hall, and IMP servers. You've aggregated all the political instability that defined the HOI4 sphere, like Tsar's notorious coup d'etat and TFR, and put it all under one much larger and potentially much more vulnerable roof.
That's an interesting point, and I do acknowledge the historical weight of that 4-part failure model. But I would frame it differently. I'd emphasize the key structural and constitutional divergence of Salubriety. The previous successions, Gnarlos, Panopticon, they all fundamentally maintained the old cultural parameters defined by Cestino's modding attempts and the IMP pseudo-culture that followed. They were extensions, not replacements.
They were definitely attempts at continuity, yes.
Right, but Salubriety, instead, established a completely new constitutional basis. It rooted its ownership core, Tyrone Chicken, A1, in groups that had nothing to do with HOI4 server drama or Meat Hall social structures. Their origin was the HGSW TF2 group and the slack-jawed antecedents. It's a distinct lineage of digital community focused on gaming and social play, not political modding disputes. They were outsiders, and so they were capable of seeing the flaws.
They might have been outsiders originally, but they pretty quickly embraced the mantle of the collapsed HOI4 sphere.
They adopted the remnants of it, yes, but crucially, they did not descend from it directly. The deliberate shift in ownership, starting with A1 creating that bare-bones successor server, and ending with the provisional Salubriety government name change, that reflects an institutional declaration of independence from the cyclical chaos of Cestino and Jake. The new leadership didn't inherit the HOI4 cultural debt. They confiscated the population and assets and imposed a new foundational law based on Tyrone's chiller vibe. That institutional break is the fundamental difference that ensures stability. The Visigothic analogy doesn't just imply inherited fragility, it also implies the forging of a fundamentally new political order that's capable of lasting adaptation. And that's exactly what we see when we look at the successful expulsion of Klansmen and the successful integration of figures like Ira and Sjurk.
I still maintain a strong skepticism about the viability of a grand unified state built from the wreckage of such historically volatile empires. While the current stability is evident and the leadership's tactical expulsions were effective, you just can't ignore the inherited cultural friction, specifically that latent IMP versus TFR hierarchy, the structural resistance embodied by the Sjurk node, and the latent risk posed by the Meat Hall Wanderers. The proven cyclical pattern of schism in the IMP lineage strongly suggests to me that Salubrity's consolidation is merely temporary. I think we're experiencing a brief, successful interregnum before the inherent genetic flaws of its digital predecessors reassert themselves, leading to the inevitable next age of collapse.
But the evidence demonstrates that Salubriety is fundamentally different from Narlo's Nation or Panopticon. It succeeded where they failed by establishing a new institutional architecture. It broke the historical cycle through decisive leadership actions, purging the chronic agents of instability. And it succeeded by truly integrating diverse histories, DC, Atlantropa, Mead Hall, not by trying to enforce a single niche identity defined by modding. This demonstrated capacity for adaptation, for establishing a government with centralized executive power where none existed before. That is the true guarantor of its long-term future.
Regardless of whether Salubriety ultimately fragments or persists, the digital history of these communities illustrates a really profound and complex anthropology of groups. It shows that the fate of any successor culture, digital or physical, it hinges entirely on its ability to transcend the deep structural and cultural fragmentation of its past, and that's a historical tension that is still very much unfolding for the federal Salubriety government.